Welcome back, I'm JC, and on today's episode of Confident Real Estate, we're going to be discussing due diligence. What is it? When do you do it? And how do you do it? Get ready. Are you ready? We've got some new art, same mantras. Let's begin. Due diligence. Extremely important and unfortunately sometimes overlooked. Most real estate investors only learn about what they're supposed to be looking for after they've been burned the first few times. Unless, of course, they've hired qualified legal counsel who knows how to guide them and knows what to look for. When to do it. Ideally, you'll have a contingency period built into your contract so that you have X amount of days after you've locked the property up in contract in order to do your thorough due diligence and get comfortable with the property itself. If you don't like it for whatever reason, you walk away, you get your down payment deposit back, and everybody goes on living life. If you can't get it built into the contract as a contingency period, then you're going to want to do basic due diligence before you sign on the dotted line. Otherwise, you're locked in. If you find something that you don't like later on, too bad. If you need lender financing and the lenders don't like what you found, you're losing your entire down payment. It's basically how it works, more or less. What type of basic due diligence? You're going to want to do some title searches. You're going to want to do a thorough review of the rent roll, make sure there's no rent regulations affecting the property, make sure the property is being used for the right use, all things you could find at local municipality, government, public information. Possibly you want to do a phase 1 environmental report. These are all things we'll discuss more in detail later on. General gist of what you should be looking for. Each jurisdiction's different. Consult your attorney. Another alternative is locking the property in at a lower down payment than what the seller initially wanted, with the caveat that it's what's called a hard down payment, meaning non-refundable. Whether you choose to go forward or not, you're never going to see that money again. So you do your due diligence, you decide you don't like what's there, you're going to have to be comfortable walking away from that deposit. Story time. I was buying a property, looking to buy a property in Southampton, New York. For those of you who don't know, the Hamptons are where the rich and fancy living is, mostly during the summer months between Memorial Day and Labor Day. However, a lot of people live there year-round. So I was looking at a property. It was rent regulated. I knew most of the people in the rent roll probably had, at least during the summer months, sustainable work, but I needed to do more due diligence. The seller really thought highly of his property. His price was a bit inflated. If I recall correctly, he was asking a little over $1 million. I was trying to negotiate him down to about $900,000. I wasn't putting 10% down over $100,000. We locked the property in at $1,000 hard money deposit, with the understanding that I was going to close within 45 days. I think I had a one-time adjournment built in, so up to 60 days after we signed the contract, we were going to close. This guy was so happy, the seller, that I was giving him $1,000 and potentially going to walk away from it. The property had been on the market for a while. It wasn't during prime season. It was during winter months. Again, he was asking a bit too much, in my opinion, for what the property was worth. Long story short, we did our due diligence. I don't recall what the reason was, but whatever it was, we decided not to go forward with it. I walked away from $1,000. I could live with that a lot more than I could live with walking away from $100,000, and the seller was stunned. Me? I was happy, and I lived to fight another day. End of story time. Another option you can use for getting around the due diligence period, if you can't get it built into your contract as a contingency period, is to have the seller make representations that are basically the seller representing matters of fact related to the property, some of which are things you would normally research on your own during a due diligence period. If it turns out that the seller wasn't being truthful, then it's a default on the seller's part. Every single contract, whether it's single family residence, commercial deals, you're buying a hotel, a strip mall, whatever, there's a seller representation section For more information on the types of representations that are commonly asked for and a little more detail into what that entails, click the link below. I did a whole video on seller representations. So, what are the typical due diligence items? Title report, survey, rent roll and schedule of security deposits, service contracts, possible employees that work at the building, utilities, other expenses, environmental and engineering inspections, super important. Gonna do a whole video on that topic all by itself down the road. And of course, if you're gonna have a lender involved, they're going to want an appraisal of the property to make sure the value that you've determined the property's worth and the sellers determined the property's worth is also the value they've determined it's worth, since they're going to be putting a majority of the money up front in most situations.
First off, the title report.
If you've never seen one, you're probably curious as to what they entail. Typically, you're going to have basic municipal searches, violations, easements of record. If you don't know what an easement is, it's when somebody has a right to walk across your property. Restrictive covenants. What's that? Things that have been written into the deed that run with the land, that restrict what you can do with the land. Very rare. I've seen them a handful of times. Most of the time that I've seen them, they were completely inapplicable to common day. I've seen properties with restrictive covenants from the 1800s that say you can't have a blacksmith shop here. It's a strip mall. I don't know too many blacksmith shops. What else? Vesting deeds, which is basically the deed that the seller got when they were the purchaser and purchased the property from the prior owner, who is then the seller. You want to make sure the person selling you the property is the person who legally owns the property. Probably helpful. Mortgage schedule. It's going to show you if there's any existing mortgages on the property, if there's been any assignments of mortgage to avoid mortgage recording tax, because certain jurisdictions like New York City and most counties in New York State do have mortgage recording taxes, and if you assign the mortgage, you can avoid them. Story for another day. You also want to make sure that prior mortgages were satisfied as of record. So when a bank is paid off on the loan, they will record what's called a mortgage satisfaction. If a bank doesn't record it, which actually happens more often than you believe, because people sell the property and they don't follow up to make sure that they got a mortgage satisfaction, and the purchaser's attorney didn't follow up either because I don't know why they didn't. But anyway, you want to make sure that those mortgages have been satisfied. Otherwise, your lender's going to want to know why there are open mortgages on the property you're asking them to lend on. And if you buy for cash and go to sell later on, and that purchaser down the road has a lender or pays attention to a title report or has decent legal counsel, they're going to wonder as well. And you're going to get stuck tracking down the former lender to get the satisfaction and record it. That is a giant pain in the ass.
Up next, the survey.
Surveys. They're the diagram picture that a surveyor comes out to the property to prepare for you that says, here's my property. Here's the land around the property that I'm expecting to obtain title to. Those are boundary surveys, most commonly used. Sometimes you can get a seller's prior survey if they've done a recent mortgage financing or if they've only owned the property for the last 5-6 years, and just do an update visual inspection survey, and that updated survey is sufficient for your title purposes, for your lender's purposes, etc. It depends on how old the survey is and where the property is located. If it's a individual ranch that has 100 acres, I don't know. But if you're buying a building in the center of town, then a survey that's 5 years old could probably be updated via visual inspection, and your lender should more than likely be okay with that. Again, a lot of variables, all depends. Last type is a ALTA survey. It stands for American Land Title Association. It's also sometimes referred to as an NSPS survey, which stands for National Society of Professional Surveyors. Whew, it's a lot to spit out. What does an ALTA or NSPS survey entail that is different from a boundary or visual inspection title survey? Adjoining landowners, building setbacks, the character and location of the buildings and improvements on the actual plot of land that you're buying, things like the walls, fences, and other visible improvements that may have been made to the property since it was last purchased by the guy who's now selling it to you, and known utilities on site and their location, and maybe diagrams of easements and some other weird things. I've seen a lot of them, and they're kind of fascinating, to be honest. I'm a little bit of a nerd, if you haven't figured that out yet, and I get sucked in down the rabbit hole and spend way too much time reviewing them. But they come at a very increased cost. Please, if you can, aim for the visual update survey or the boundary survey. Hopefully your lender will accept it. Most of the time they will. Again, all dependent on variables, where you're buying, what type of deal you're structuring, how much of a loan you're taking out, etc., 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 etc. Anyway, that's surveys.
The third one is the income, the rent roll, and the schedule of security deposits.
Rents, security deposits, and arrears. Arrears, not rears. Get your mind out of the gutter. You want to review the leases. Make the seller give you the leases and try to review them before you ever sign the contract. Why? You want cash flow from rents. Rents are dictated by leases. Drill that into your head. Other things you're going to want to know are there any rent regulations on the building? Sometimes there will be local or federal agencies that pay a percentage of your tenant's rents. I'm sure you've all heard of Section 8 housing. That's a great example, the most common example. You want to review that in the leases, and you want to review it on a rent schedule. Going back to the seller reps that you want to get for due diligence that we discussed earlier, remember that? And the link below. You could click the link below for more whole video on seller reps. One of the things you want to check out is a certified rent roll that you are going to ask the seller to give you. They are going to give you the rent roll with a list of security deposits for each tenant, a list of arrears, which means people who have not paid rent and how far behind they are in the rent over a trailing 90-day schedule at least. And you're going to want to look at that rent roll with the rents, the security deposits, and arrears that the seller has signed as certifying they are true and correct as of the date of their signature. That is very helpful, and it gives you a little bit of a cushion. You still got to do the work and look into it to at least say, if you find out there's an issue, hey, seller, you lied, and this could be grounds for me seeking a return of my down payment and walking away from this deal completely, because now you're in breach of the contract. When it comes to rent-regulated units, you need to understand how the rent regulation laws work in your particular jurisdiction, and you want to learn how you can deregulate them, how you collect the rents, how you can raise the rents. All things you got to consider, and again, all based on different variables of what you're buying, where you're buying, how you're buying, and of course your purposes for buying. Are there any use restrictions? What does that mean? Does the certificate of occupancy show the same number of legal apartments that are on the rent roll that the seller certified and handed you? If they're different, that's a problem. So check that certificate of occupancy and have your title company pull it if you're not aware of how to find it in your particular jurisdiction. If there's a commercial unit, there might be use restrictions in the area that prohibit you from having a bar or a restaurant or a sex shop or a vaping store, things you got to consider. And there may even be restrictive covenants that run with the land, So again, title report, vesting deed, you'll want to look to see if there's anything that you are restricted from doing, any covenant restrictions that run with the land. It happens. Lastly, do the leases contain the standard subordination language? What's that? Your mortgage lender's gonna want to see it. If you're buying a residential property, even if it's a single family residence and you use a form lease, chances are 99% of the time the subordination language is in there. And basically it says this lease is a priority interest in the property. However, we subordinate, as a tenant, we subordinate our interest in the property to your lender, because the lender is the one with the most skin in the game, and they always want to make sure that their investment is protected and that they have the right to stand first in line in the event that they need to sue you. Everybody else, such as the tenant, can stand right here behind them. In a commercial context, your lender may require an estoppel certificate. To be honest, you should probably require an estoppel certificate as well if there's a commercial component to the property. We're going to get into what those are momentarily. If there's no subordination language in the leases in the commercial context, then your lender may require what's called a subordination, non-disturbance, and attornment agreement. For short, SNDA. This is a piece of paper. If you write estoppel certificate at the top of it and fill it in with certain information, it's an estoppel certificate. If you take that information off of it, it's a piece of paper. That's all it is. So what does an estoppel certificate entail? In short, it's a signed statement by a tenant that gives certain information about what their understanding of the lease is versus the understanding of the lease as the seller presented it to you. That's basically all it is. SNDAs, in short, tenants signing off on a subordination of their leasehold interest to the mortgage lender that is your lender in the acquisition of the property. There's a whole lot more that goes into both of them. None of it's that brain intensive, but we can break it down and compartmentalize it and attack it to make it very easy to understand. In fact, I did. Click the link below. If you want to learn more about estoppel certificates and subordination, non-disturbance, and attornment agreements, click the link below. I promise I try to make it as interesting as I can and informative as I can. But until you click the link below, you're not going to know how good a job I did. So click the link below.
Service contracts and possible employees.
If the rent roll determines how much money you have coming in, this next topic, service contracts and employees, determines how much of that money is going to somebody else before it comes to you. Understanding the expenses means reviewing the actual service contracts, figuring out what's assignable, what you actually want to assume. Maybe you can get a better deal on, say, property management because you have a great property manager managing your other properties in the same town 2 blocks over, and you can get a better deal getting them to manage it than the current manager who you've never heard of in your life. You also want to determine what's terminable. So, can you terminate that contract with that property manager you've never heard of, which after looking at the property and realizing it's in poor condition and not being maintained properly, which is why you're buying it, because there's a quick value add upside, you probably want to let that managing agent go. So what are the types of expenses you can expect to encounter under service contracts and employees? Well, let's run through the list. Property managing agents. I think we already covered that. Exterminator service. Even if you don't have roaches, mice, rats, they're probably there. hire an exterminator to come at least once a month. Trust me, it is much harder to keep a tenant that is a good tenant renewing the lease long term if they're sharing the apartment with insects and rodents that are not family members or pets. Alarm monitoring. If you have a big enough property, you're going to have a fire alarm, possibly sprinkler system, and alarm monitoring is just something you got to pay for. So check it out. Maybe you have an elevator. If you have an elevator, then that's going to need to be maintained and go through inspections. And there's an agreement for service that goes along with that as well. When you pulled up to the property for the first time, did you think, wow, that's got great curb appeal? If you did, there's a landscaping agreement. If you live in the Northeast or the Northwest or the Midwest or basically the northern half of the United States of America or anywhere else that has the potential for snow, there's probably a snow removal contract as well. A lot of these may not actually be contracts. They may just be, agreements that were never signed in actual document form. Therefore, get the contact information. Who knows? They know the property. Maybe they're halfway decent. If the landscaper, when you pulled up to the property, did not look like they were doing a good job, there's another agreement you want to terminate prior to closing. Lastly, the employees. Porters, superintendents, maintenance workers. Depends how big the building is. Depends what type of property it is. All things you just got to take into consideration. Are they people you want to keep? Are they people you want to terminate? Are they doing a good job? Are they not? Variables. You'll figure it out. Just be aware they exist.
Number 5, utilities and other expenses.
Utilities and other expenses. If you're a homeowner, actually, in most cases, if you're a home occupier, even a renter, you are well aware of what utilities entail. But in case you're not, when you turn on the faucet and the water comes out, someone's paying for that, even if it's not you. If you're renting, guess what? It's your landlord. And it's built into the price you pay every month in your lease. Gas, electric, if you're buying a multifamily property, and there's multiple apartments, obviously, and they're not separately metered, then you really got to understand the expenses and crunch the numbers so you could figure out whether the cash flow coming out of the rents after the expenses are paid are justifiable for your investment purposes. I think it's time for a story. Story time. So one time, we were looking at a property, and the utilities were not separately metered for each of the individual apartments. And as we were going to take a look at the property, I realized it was the middle of the day on a weekday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, something like that. And everybody was at work for the most part who lived at the property, except for the guy who was having a band rehearsal with electric instruments. Come to find out, he's also a DJ. His girlfriend is a hairdresser who has appointments in the apartment. Basically, they're using a lot of utilities, and they're paying the same rent as the old lady 2 flights down who doesn't turn on the lights. Things to consider. End of story time.
Inspections, both environmental and engineering. Very important.
Inspections, environmental and engineering, structural inspections. Very, very important. Again, as we discussed earlier, if you aren't able to build in a due diligence contingency period into your actual contract document, then, essentially you're buying what's commonly referred to as an as-is, where-is property. You're buying it as it is, where it is, whatever crap is attached to it. If there's major structural issues, if there's seeping sewage coming up from underneath it, below the ground, they're all yours. Enjoy. Please do these inspections before you sign on the dotted line. You don't want to inherit and pay for a property that has tremendous environmental issues or structural issues. Whenever you hear environmental issue or structural issue, you should hear cha-ching, 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 because that's what it's going to cost you. Do the inspections as soon as you can. You should have some idea of what's around the property, the surrounding areas, a phase 1 environmental report. It's non-invasive. Nobody's drilling in the ground. No seller should object to it. Structural inspections, non-invasive. Nobody should object to it. If they're trying to sell you the property, they should understand it. Try to get them done. And again, talk to your attorney and have them delay the contract negotiations while you do these inspections. That way, you still get them done before you've put any money down and signed on the dotted line. So simple. Lastly, an appraisal.
If you're going to have a lender involved, you're going to need an appraisal.
An appraisal is only going to be required if you have a lender who is giving you debt financing. They want to make sure that what you think the property's worth and what the seller thinks the property's worth is what they also think the property's worth. FYI, 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell you they think the property's worth a little bit less than you do, but they'll still make the loan. There it is. Due diligence. We covered it. Hopefully, you feel a little bit more confident going into your next deal. Again, as always, experience is the best teacher. We're just trying to provide a little bit of a knowledge foundation to help you as you go along in your investment journey and cultivate the experiences for yourself. It's easier to pull the trigger when you have the knowledge and the confidence. Until next time, on Confident Real Estate, I'm JC. Don't forget, discipline never leads to failure, just like excuses never lead to success. See you next time.